The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, the maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 6 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS America product lineup includes three-phase string inverters ranging from 25 to 275 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 250-275, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. The 250-275 pairs well with CPS America's exceptional data communication, controls, and energy storage solutions. Go to chintpowersystems.com to find out more.
Sometimes I feel that climate change advocates, people of more progressive mentalities, there is this tendency to paint the picture very, very black and white. White being good, being clean energy.
Sure.
Black being bad, being the fossil fuel industry. And I think it's worth noting that there have been some significant progresses within major fossil fuel players in this country to clean things up, so to speak. Yes, I get it. They have been guilty of their sins in the past. But in terms of cost for electricity on the grid, in terms of short-term capacities, renewables are winning out more often than not, for sure. In terms of long duration capacity, fossil fuels still are needed for a vibrant, functioning, successful utility grid here in this country.
Are you speeding the energy transition? Here at the Clean Power Hour, our host Tim Montague bring you the best in solar, batteries, and clean technologies every week. Want to go deeper into decarbonization? We do too. We're here to help you understand and command the commercial, residential, and utility solar, wind, and storage industries. So let's get to it. Together we can speed the energy transition.
Today on the Clean Power Hour, a pragmatist's guide to energizing the USA. My guest today is Rick Wrenn. He is the author of a new book called A Pragmatist's Guide to Energizing the USA. It is all about the energy transition that you and I are witnessing as we speak. And my listeners know that one of the greatest forces in the energy transition is money and profit. We are saying goodbye to the coal and natural gas and oil facilities across the United States because they are less economical than solar, wind, and storage. So we're going to geek out on this. Please check out all of my content at cleanpowerhour.com. Give me a rating and a review on Apple or Spotify, and reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love hearing from my listeners. So welcome to the show, Rick Wrenn.
Thank you very much for having me, Tim. It is a pleasure to be here, sir.
I don't often meet people who have accomplished such a feat as you have in such a short period of time in terms of digesting the energy transition and then writing a book about it. But Rick, tell our listeners a little bit about how you got interested in energy and the energy transition.
Great question. And I would say is somewhat of a divergence from normal professionals you may have as guests on your show, Tim. I really didn't come from the energy background at all. My background for a decade and a half was in the specialty compounds industry, business development, sales, ultimately in operations management. But as an operations manager, I did some investigative work in potentially leveraging distributed energy solutions and assets we owned in Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, just to really see if we couldn't optimize costs as best as possible. And was amazed at that time just how attractive distributed energy solutions, and these were just CNI scale solar panels, could be compared to utility powered electricity. That was a decade ago. So kind of, I guess that initial ignition, that initial spark in this space formed then. Flash forward another 5 years, ended up leaving that industry, made a career pivot into the startup space, and really just started trying to focus my efforts in networking and ingraining myself within climate tech, and really haven't looked back ever since. When I decided to pull the official formal trigger on this book, rewind about a year and a quarter ago, a third ago, the startup I was working with, we unfortunately had to close our doors. Was looking for work, wasn't finding what I was hoping and expecting to find. So decided to actually utilize the available time I had to do something constructive, not just apply for jobs all day long. So that's when I formally pulled the trigger to write this book. Several months of research, several months of drafting and editing, another 3-ish months of editing with the publisher I subcontracted with. And into September, we had a finished, viable product. So here we are today talking about it.
The book opens with a chapter on coal, then it segues to natural gas, then it covers renewable energy, solar and wind, and then it talks about battery storage, electrification of transportation, the oil industry, biofuels, hydrogen, and I assume, I have not read it cover to cover, but I assume there are some references to, nuclear and that kind of thing. But Rick, I would love to hear your thoughts for the audience that is not convinced that the energy transition is inevitable and is not convinced that we actually have the means to make the transition to wind, solar, and batteries. What do you say to those people about our state of affairs in the energy economy today?
Well, I would encourage each and every one of those individuals to look at my book when they have the opportunity, not to do a little bit of unsolicited selling right here on your podcast, sir. But what I tried to do in A Pragmatist Guide is I really try to steer clear and intertwining too much the conversation of climate change, because it's a polarizing topic. I get it. Not everybody subscribes to the tenets of it. So we don't need to go into too much detail on that. So what I instead try to do is really just focus on hard-lined numbers, economics, practical and fiscal data, expert testimony, not just what's happening in renewables, but what's happening in the fossil fuel industry on the whole, and really give the reader a synthesized, holistic, yet succinct summary of these markets, of these technologies, of these solutions. So to more immediately address your request here, Tim, what would I tell folks with regards to the energy transition and why we should encourage it to unfold? Well, the cost data really tells you all you need to know. On average, right now in the United States, the costs for solar and onshore wind on average are very, very comparable, even with 4-hour short-term battery storage, very, very comparable, if not cheaper than combined cycle natural gas. That obviously doesn't apply to every single individual segment of the country, but in vast swathes of the country, the Midwest, the Southwest in particular. It just makes all the economic sense to adopt and embrace more renewable, more clean-oriented energy onto the grid to enhance the amount of power availability that utility customers have, and to abut the growing and burgeoning needs we have for energy in this country and worldwide.
And burgeoning needs we have. One of the fairly grim statistics that I regularly hear is that with all the additional wind, solar, and batteries that we're adding to the grid, we're really only keeping up with the additional demand of our data centers and our AI data centers now, right, which are in the news every day. We're super power hungry, and then there's the energy. I mean, the electrification of transportation and HVAC. Those couple of phenomena are driving our hunger for electricity. And so we need a lot of electricity. Now, the good news, which some of my listeners will remember, is that we get 5 to 10,000 times more solar energy, in photons free from the sun every day, right, than all of society uses. And so we're just swimming in renewable energy. And it's just a matter of installing the technology, the solar panels, the wind turbines, and now the batteries, because we need storage to, keep everything running when those intermittent resources are not. But I wonder what else both my energy professional audience, okay, that is my core audience, but also lay people who are curious about the energy transition and don't really understand some of these things that you and I are going to continue to talk about here, though, that economics are the main driver. I care a lot about the environment and creating a safer, healthier future for humanity, for example, which the energy transition is certainly a part of. But most business people, we have to face this reality. 90% of business people are really only interested in turning a profit and keeping their venture running, whatever that is. And nonetheless, right, the energy transition is happening because wind and solar, and now batteries, are cost competitive with traditional sources. They're more competitive than coal, and they're now more competitive than natural gas in many places. And that's why if you're a utility that operates fleets of power plants, in your plan, right, you're in your 5-year plan, you are integrating those wind, solar, battery farms into your portfolio because that is good for your stakeholders, right, your investors. Bottom dollar. How do we get others to understand this? And I guess I would love for you to give us an example of how these economics are basically a forcing function for the transition, right? It's not so much a matter of willpower. It's a matter of this huge force called capitalism, right, that is pushing back on the option that a utility has of installing one technology or another.
So, as mentioned earlier, Tim, when you're looking at the actual cost of energy to your grid, and again, these accounting terms, things like the levelized cost of energy, levelized avoided cost of energy, the value cost ratio to the grid, these are the kind of the paramount accounting terminologies and metrics used to measure this. They all point very, very positively in the direction for solar and inshore wind, specifically and especially in, again, certain segments and regions of the country. But I do think it's worth pointing out, Tim, that sometimes I feel that climate change advocates, people of more progressive mentalities, there is this tendency to paint the picture very, very black and white. White being good, being clean energy,
Sure.
Black being bad, being the fossil fuel industry. And I think it's worth noting that there have been some significant progresses within major fossil fuel players in this country to clean things up, so to speak. Yes, I get it. They have been guilty of their sins in the past. But in terms of cost for electricity on the grid, in terms of short-term capacities, renewables are winning out more often than not, for sure. In terms of long duration capacity, fossil fuels still are needed for a vibrant, functioning, successful utility grid here in this country. So as we're working to develop and flesh out and harness long-term capacity storage solutions, I think we should be encouraging and applauding and lauding a lot of these major producers that are working to quote unquote clean up their act. I'll name a few right now. EQT is the largest producer of natural gas in this country. They've already, ahead of schedule, eliminated I say eliminated, achieved net zero Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions throughout their operations. They were aiming for 2025. They accomplished that near end of Q4 this year. Recently public venture called BKV out of Denver, they have some very, very audacious plans to for net zero CO2 emissions, both post and pre-combustion by 2030. These efforts we should be we should be encouraging across the energy sector as we again look to leverage more responsibly sourced fossil fuels with the lowest carbon footprints we can get, as well as recognizing that the economics, again, for renewables are already there, will continue to be there due to the innovations we're seeing in this space. The cost of battery storage has dropped 20% thus far in 2024. Those costs are going to continue to decrease. There are some interesting, relatively cheap solar components that could significantly boost efficiencies in the very near term future. This innovation is happening, and once this innovation hits the market, it's going to make even more economic sense. So these are stuff we should be tracking, should be trending, of course, working to develop and harness long-term capacity, as well as applauding the efforts for some of these quote unquote bad actors once upon a time ago, now that are cleaning up their act and recognizing the immediacy of climate change and the need to again provide clean energies with some of their hydrocarbons to the grid, to the masses.
I mean, I personally am coming around to a point of view that we in the clean energy sector, okay, I work with solar installers or solar and battery installers primarily and developers. We could partner more with the fossil industries. As it turns out, Rick, making the energy transition, right? Let's talk about big picture, net zeroing the economy. That's a 50 gigaton pollution problem. Well, there's 1 trillion tons of CO2 pollution in the atmosphere that we also have to remove. And that's a 20 times bigger problem than net zeroing the economy. So by the time we net zero the economy, CO2 in the atmosphere is going to be at 450 ppm. Okay, that's a harsh reality. I was rudely awakened last year by this statistic from Peter Fikowski's book on climate restoration. When I was born, ppms were 320. Okay, fast forward 60 years, we're at 420 and we're headed to 450. So whether or not we believe in climate change, this circumstance is very real. And then as you point out, new sources, in terms of new sources of power on the grid, wind and solar are something like 82% of the new energy coming onto the grid now. And that is strictly because of the affordability of those technologies, really. I mean, policy matters and policy is changing and policy does drive these things. But trust me, the subsidies that fossil fuels receive are still much, much greater than the subsidies for wind and solar by I would venture a factor of 6. I don't know exactly what that statistic is. Maybe you know what that is. So we don't actually have to stop using fossil fuels. That's the good news. And we should save fossil fuels for a rainy day, actually, right? They're a super precious, super valuable resource. I mean, 1 barrel of oil produces 5 man-hours of work. It's 5 man-years of work. It's an amazing amount of work that you can do with 1 barrel of oil. And I just think, wow, that's a super precious resource. We should sip it instead of guzzle it. And we are starting to do that, but we're really just nipping at the heels. So I think it would be very helpful though, Rick, if we could do a little deep dive here on energy storage, and because that is front and center for most energy professionals, whether they're wind developers, wind installers, solar developers, solar installers. Storage has become a super viable and super important part of the industry. And all of my audience is now trying to figure out ways to integrate more storage into their projects. So what is your take on energy storage, and what are the technologies that you see rising further to the top? I mean, lithium is there front and center. Is that going to change anytime soon?
I don't think so, Tim. And this is a fantastic question. I think storage is so paramount in so many ways. Fun fact to your listeners, Tim, utility scale BESS was essentially non-existent on the U.S. grid prior to 2020. Then it charged like a raging bull onto our grid, and it's still going strong. We're probably going to quadruple our storage BESS capacities in this country in between now and the beginning of 2030. But when it came onto the grid and when it charged like a raging bull onto the grid, Tim, it wasn't due to renewable co-location, not at all. It was due to resource adequacy for fossil fuel generation. What do I mean when I say that? I mean that there are several regions in this country, California, Texas being one and two, that when the summer heat arises, the grid, the established grid infrastructure cannot handle the energy demands in terms of generation, in terms of delivery. So they have installed utility scale BESS systems to this grid to charge during off-peak hours when electricity, of course, is much cheaper. And there's not a surplus of it, so to speak, but you can easily throttle up the generation valve and produce more of it and discharge during hours and episodes of peak demand in order to ensure resource supply to these localities, these regional grids. So again, resource adequacy and pricing arbitrage were the number one. Number two, applications for BESS. This is all lithium ion BESS, in particular lithium phosphate ion BESS. But we're seeing lithium prices drop. We're seeing more and more onshoring of lithium beneficiation within the United States, which is a very, very positive action, very, very positive action forward. This will continue to lower lithium ion storage costs. And I also think you're seeing some novel, diverse storage strategies that should be making a market introduction here within the next year, maybe two. Sodium ion, which you've probably heard of before, Tim, that is going to be estimated cheap, 20% lower cost than lithium ion. It's not going to be as effective. It's not going to be as energy dense. It's going to have a lower life cycle, but the lower costs can't be ignored. And again, I am increasingly bullish on long duration energy storage as we work to flesh out these solutions, as we look to curtail their costs. But energy storage is paramount for the clean energy transition. You cannot effectively supply a very, very vibrant motile grid with intermittent electricity sources. You have to firm up those sources. You have to make sure they are available when needed. And the best way to do that is, of course, the best way to control those economics is what we're seeing right now. Make that as, again, fiscally responsible as possible. You don't, of course, don't want to be in episodes 2 with renewables where you're having to curtail large volumes of generated electricity because the wind happens to be blowing at a period of time when no one's around to really use it, or the sun is shining during the middle of the day when grid demands aren't their highest.
In a way, California did us a favor when they instituted NEM 3.0, right, which decimated the residential distributed generation, right? Residential solar industry was reduced by 70% by NEM 3.0. Basically, they're devaluing solar electrons. But what this does is it enhances the value of energy storage and increases the attachment rate of batteries. And so if you're a solar installer working in some other market, just follow closely the more mature markets. And what you see is the value of solar being reduced, so net metering being reduced, and storage attachment rates going up. And this trend is going to continue. Here in Illinois, we're doing our first major step down of net metering in January of 2025, and battery attachment rates are going to go up. And so if you don't see yourself as a solar and battery or solar plus developer and installer, you definitely want to get on that train. There was something else though here. It's not new to my listeners that or lost on them that wind and solar are intermittent, and that is often a criticism that lay people will make, and so that is why it is really a tripartite, right? Wind and solar complement each other. The wind blows more in the winter when we have less solar radiation, and then you use batteries. 4 to 12 hour. You don't need 100 hour. 100 hour storage is amazing and cool. And we have some technologies, as you know, like iron air batteries, right, for very long duration storage. But those technologies are not quite there on the economic side of things. And so most of what is happening is like 2 to 4 hour lithium ion technology, as far as I can see it. The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, the maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 6 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS America product lineup includes three-phase string inverters ranging from 25 to 275 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 250-275, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. The 250-275 pairs well with CPS America's exceptional data communication, controls, and energy storage solutions. Go to chintpowersystems.com to find out more. So before we segue to a discussion about electrification of transportation and everything, right? That is the expression I love, electrifying everything. What else should our listeners know about energy storage and how they can take advantage of that, whether they're a prosumer who could install a battery in their garage, or a business owner who could install a battery in their warehouse or in their showroom or in their manufacturing plant? What else do you think people need to understand about battery storage?
Great question, Tim. And again, battery storage is so much more than simply allowing renewables to be a viable propellant for our grid. It is an issue of pricing arbitrage to where you can literally lower your home or CNI cost, electricity cost, by drawing electricity from the grid during off-peak hours when your dollars per kilowatt hour are 2 to 5 cents, and discharging during peak demand episodes where your cents per kilowatt hour are quadruple that figure. There are numerous entities. You're seeing CNI battery adoption year over year growing at I want to say 12, maybe 13% rate moving forward throughout the 2030s, because industries, businesses, commercial enterprises are understanding this. You're seeing, of course, an even larger clip year-over-year growth rate for utility scale, and you'll see some from residences as well. Again, these numbers will become even more profound and even more attractive as we onshore more lithium production capabilities, more sodium ion solutions and alternatives become available, and more and more people get on board with this concept. Because I do think batteries are even more dynamic right now than solar and inshore wind, and understandably so. So it's certainly something to follow and listen to. And I've heard this critique before too, Tim, about the intermittency of renewables. People will look at localized marginal pricing and say, oh my gosh, look how expensive the grid is right now. This is evidence, A through Z, why clean energy transition just won't work. It's like, guys, a snapshot in time is not an accurate depiction of reality. The levelized cost of energy, the levelized avoided cost of energy, the value cost ratio numbers speak for themselves. Now, albeit They may not tell the complete and total picture. There are some attributes that are not included in those metrics, but the fact that they look so attractive today versus combined cycle natural gas absolutely warrant further consideration and investigation into their legitimate holistic viability.
So let's talk about electrification of transportation. Transportation has a big energy footprint. It is a big polluter. And, places like Northern Europe have made the transition faster to electric vehicles because gasoline is very expensive there, perhaps 3 or 4 times in some places, as expensive as it is here. They don't have the native massive fossil resources that we have. But as you document, EVs are a real and growing phenomenon, despite a lot of negative press in 2024. Okay. 2024 was a bit of a reckoning for the EV industry. I think it's just going to be a temporary bump in the road, and it's going to come right back. And some of the reasons for that are that, these cars have many fewer moving parts. And so once you bring down the cost of the storage, the battery, that's the major expense in these vehicles, right? That makes them relatively pricey. But guess what? They'll go for 1 million miles, right? A fossil fueled vehicle is not going to go 1 million miles, maybe 200, maybe 300,000, but we're looking at a 3x lifetime usage of an EV. And so the economics, again, are going to win out in the long run. It's just a question of when, right? So what did you learn, though, drilling down on the electrification of transportation?
So we talk a lot in this country about energy independence. It came up multiple times in our most recent presidential election. I firmly believe, and I believe the data substantiates this, that there are pinhole leaks throughout the entire argument that the United States can drill its way into energy independence. Pinhole leaks, and I elaborate much further about this in my book. One way I think energy independence is much more feasible is by continuing to supplant ICE with EVs. To be clear, Tim, I really don't think ICE vehicles will go the way of the dodo anytime soon, anytime within the foreseeable future. There are operational, quote unquote, comforts associated with ICE vehicle operation that some people will not get rid of. But the more EVs that you can produce stateside and supply stateside, the less oil, and which will ultimately be some foreign oil, we have to depend on. And if we can ultimately get to the point where we have supplanted all of our foreign oil demands with things like electrified vehicles, with things like the electrification of everything, the better off we'll be, the less susceptible we'll be to any foreign malicious party influences and any sort of exogenous events that are completely out of our control. That's what I believe we should be shooting towards. And to answer your question here, and to provide a little more clarity here as well, Tim, I mentioned earlier that battery pack costs on the average have dropped about 20% thus far in 2024. There are select passenger EVs on the market today that have hit that rule of thumb threshold of around $100 per kilowatt. That's that magic rule of thumb threshold to where EVs are achieving that cost parity with ICE vehicles. We weren't quite there when I wrote my book. I think EVs were still a little bit more expensive, but again, the rate of innovation, the market adoption was all favoring EVs. And that is still the case today. And I think even more so, it's even more exemplary today than it was this time last year.
So I want to get clarity on what our status is as an oil producing nation. Are we a net importer or exporter of oil that's getting converted to fuel to run transportation?
That's a very difficult question to answer confidently, Tim. And to be clear, if you look at the numbers posited by the Energy Information Administration, they'll wholeheartedly admit it's difficult to track imports, exports, what's what. They kind of all go into a big quote unquote refining pot. But I'll provide a little bit of clarity. And again, I go into much more detail about this in my book. Interestingly enough, we're a net exporter of petroleum related products. A big part of that is crude, but we're a net importer of crude oil. So you've heard folks posit, oh, well, we'll just drill more and we won't have to import any more crude. Well, guys, we don't import crude because we're not drilling enough. We produce more petroleum than we use currently stateside. We don't have the refining capacity to handle all of the petroleum we produce to make this quote unquote crude product.
And so you think we've reached a point, though, where electric vehicles are cost competitive with ICE vehicles?
In select regards, select markets, yes. I think we're starting to hit that proverbial tipping point. We were close last year. We've been close for a while. Obviously, depending upon your specific use cases, you probably already were cheaper than ICE, but that's not for the quote unquote market on the whole. We're hitting that tipping point today.
Yeah, I just did this query using a search engine called Perplexity, and it seems to think that 2025 is a tipping point, so to speak. So I have nothing against fossil fuels, as my listeners know. They gave us the good life that we have, okay, which is an amazing life. And I want future generations to have the good life. And that's one of the reasons we have to embrace weaning ourselves off of the fossil economy so that we can save some and have some for future generations and reduce the negative health and climate impacts, right, of burning fossil fuels. We have to realize, okay, you can deny climate change all you want, but you can't deny that air pollution kills, right? So we want a safer, healthier future for humanity. And one way to ensure that is to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. Of course, you can also make the burning of them cleaner, and we've been doing that, right, by improving pollution controls. It's a both and. So in our last couple of minutes together, Rick, what else would you like my listeners to know about your book and the topics covered, which are largely related to the energy transition?
Yeah, absolutely, sir. So, Tim, you hit on all the chapter titles, so to speak, of my book, A Pragmatist Guide to Energizing the USA. In my last and final chapter, it's really somewhat of an amalgamation of topics I did not hit on or you mentioned earlier. I definitely talk about nuclear energy. I talk about offshore wind. I talk about hydroelectric. I talk about geothermal. Very, very, very bullish on geothermal moving forward, especially once they figure out how to leverage the synergies we've garnered and gleaned from hydraulic fracking, things like horizontal wells, things like multiple vertical wells. We can take that technology and we can transition it from geothermal right now is pretty much sequestered to the West Coast. We can take that, not necessarily nationwide, but we can take it out of the West Coast and beyond the West Coast, and of course, continue to build up the infrastructure presence in that part of the country. I even talk a little bit about fusion, which will cause a number of eyes to roll. And I'm not saying fusion's coming on board anytime soon, but if you look at the collective billions that have been spent in this space already, and have been committed to this space, we'll see. We'll see. So again, I think I hit on all the primary energy fixtures that constitute our nationwide energy matrix. And again, for the energy professional and even for the proverbial common layman that just wants to learn more and doesn't want to research for 4 months like I did, or kind of really wants to stay away from really the politicized nature of these topics, I really think my book is a holistic, comprehensive resource for these individuals. Again, I do promote the energy transition, but much like you, Tim, I mean, fossil fuels absolutely have a presence within our grid. They are a mainstay fixture, and I don't see them disappearing anytime within the next 20, 25 years. I do think they'll continue to be there, and it's not a bad thing.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I want to thank Rick Wrenn, author of A Pragmatist's Guide to Energizing the U.S.A., for coming on the show. Please check out all of our content at cleanpowerhour.com. Give us a rating and a review on Apple or Spotify. Tell a friend about the show. That is one of the best things you can do to let others know that there are all these interesting people that I interview week in and week out, including authors like Rick Wrenn. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, the maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 6 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS America product lineup includes three-phase string inverters ranging from 25 to 275 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 250-275, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. The 250-275 pairs well with CPS America's exceptional data communication, controls, and energy storage solutions. Go to chintpowersystems.com to find out more.